This is Ken Beers with Boxer Life Sciences, presenting Python Pharmaceutical Forecasting, software for the economic analysis of drug development, commercialization, and deals. In an earlier video, we showed how to apply this software to value a drug that's entering phase 3 and then simulate and design an in-licensing deal for it. In this video, we're going to be revisiting that example to go through the coding of the model in depth. Again, the case example we're looking at is one in which we are a pharma company looking to in-license an asset that's about to enter phase 3 in January 2026, and we want to value it and draft deal terms. This drug is a weekly injectable that treats a chronic disease. We're going to just be looking at the US. We have a phase 3 program with 2 parallel trials, each with the specified cost, duration, and chance of success. If both those succeed, we move to regulatory review that carries with it additional time, cost, and risk. And if that's successful, then we're approved and we can start to get sales of the drug. In addition to our own development, we're going to be modeling here a head-to-head pipeline competitor that's going to launch at the same time and has a 50% chance of approval. In order to model the asset, we have a number of assumptions that we make around the diagnosis rate, the fraction of diagnosed patients being treated, and then preference share as it grows over time to a peak value that's going to be dependent upon the competitor launch. With no competitor, we assume a 50% peak preference share. If we do have a competitor, it's reduced to 33%. So as we build the model, we're going to want to change the peak share to make it be contingent upon the competitor launch. We also make assumptions about market exclusivity and adherence to this weekly protocol. We price the drug based on an annual list price, again specifying what the growth of that is going to be, and then set cost of goods sold from a gross margin. We adjust the preference share assumptions we make for access, where in the US we model public payers and private payers with different access levels at each. These access levels act like a haircut to reduce the preference share based on things like out-of-pocket expense and other forms of payer restrictions such as step edits or prior authorizations in the US. We also have a gross to net, which in the US would reflect rebates and discounts paid to payers. Like peak preference share, this is going to depend on whether we have a competitor. If there's no competitor, we have 25% gross to net. If we do have a competitor, it's going to be a more challenging contracting situation, and that gross to net rate rises to 50%. This again is another assumption that we're going to make be contingent upon whether the competitor launches. Finally, we have a number of commercial costs that go aside the development costs. We have an annual spend that's going to run from approval to 5 years post LOE. And then if we're successful in phase 3, we're going to have to spend another bolus of investment over the subsequent year to build commercial capabilities in advance of launch. That's going to be an at-risk expense. And then finally, even though we're primarily modeling this asset to include the synergy that we bring to the deal, we also want to model an alternative go-to-market scenario in which the originator decides not to out-license, but instead brings the drug to market themselves. In that case, we're going to assume the promotional reach falls, and there's going to be a larger amount of investment that originator is going to need to make to build commercial capabilities. We do this alternative scenario in order to get the best alternative to negotiated agreement for the originator to get some sense about how much room do we have when it comes to value capture under this deal. So even though this is a very simple case example, this shares a lot of the complexities that we see in real life. We have an uncertain competitor set. We have a number of different clinical and commercial assumptions we need to make that's informed by the kind of market research that we do. And then we have to consider alternative go-to-market scenarios to look at different strategic options. To model this system in PPFC, we need to map the inputs that we have to the structures that PPFC uses, the first of which is a development path that describes clinical development and market evolution, in this case, the uncertain launch of a competitor. How these development paths work is there are graphs of stages, which are these elements in the dark blue rectangles, and the states that are the blue diamonds. We initially start and set a state P3 start, and we set that to true as of January 2026. What true means is that we have successfully reached that, or if we treat that as a decision variable, it means that we turn on that individual path in the overall development path. When P3 begins, and it's true, that then would enable the start of these two stages, P3A and P3B, each of which carries its own probability of technical success, cost, and duration. If those are successful, then it sets the state immediately after that, P3A success, P3B success, to true. If it fails, it's false. We then have a stage that doesn't carry any risk or cost, but just requires that both phase 3A and phase 3B are both success in order for us to declare success overall in phase 3. If that occurs, then we move on to regulatory review that incurs yet more cost, time, and risk, and if that's successful, we have an approval. That approval state is going to be true if we launch. With regulatory approval, it's going to be false if we fail anywhere earlier in that, either in phase 3 or in the regulatory review. And that's the state that when we write our model, we're going to make realizing product share be conditional upon successfully reaching. In addition to clinical development, we also then have stages for uncertain evolutions in the market. In this case, the development of a competitor that has a 50% chance of succeeding and having a competitor that would launch. We don't incur any cost with this. We set the duration so that the competitor launches when we expect it to. Here we have just a single competitor. We could have multiple competitors, and then, somewhat similar to what we did in phase 3, have different individual states that see true, false, depending on which competitors have launched, to have unique future market scenarios and then make separate assumptions and edits to variables for each one of those. We also use a graphical approach to describe the flow of patients in a model. In this case, we have a very simple prevalence model where we start off with prevalent patients. We're going to be tracking the populations in each stock on a monthly basis, which is what PPFC does. We take prevalent patients, then there's a flow DX that moves 90% of those to diagnosed, a flow TX that moves 75% of those diagnosed to treated, and a flow 1L, which is a first-line allocation of patients to a drug, product X, and we give it the name of a stock, product X1L, that's going to identify patients who are now active on therapy on our drug. In addition to all the different assumptions that we make about preference share, finally, when we assign patients to our individual drug, we're going to layer on top of this payer-specific access assumptions and then also promotional reach assumptions, which we're going to change then depending upon whether the originator out-licenses or not. After we calculate the monthly patient populations in each stock, since we declare product X is a drug that's used in this product X1L stock, we take the number of patients in that stock and multiply it by the expected number of units, in this case weekly injections, and are going to be delivered each month based on the dosing schedule and based on the adherence. And then they take those monthly unit volumes, multiply it by the current list price per unit, and that gives us our gross revenues, and then we apply this gross to net rate to get net revenues, which with more competition is going to have a higher gross to net rate, means we're going to have a greater gap between gross and net revenues. We then take those volumes and sales and we compute the other costs, cost of goods sold, SG&A, which is going to be marketing, sales, any other kinds of costs that we need commercially to support the product, and then development costs to get a P&L, which is going to give us earnings before interest and taxes and net present value. PPFC works on a pre-tax basis, but then if we want to do individual tax treatments, it's easy to adjust the model to apply whatever type of tax treatment we want. In addition to the asset that we're going to value ourselves, we also want to link a licensing deal to this asset so that we can model the economics to both parties, the originator or the seller and the end licensor or the buyer, per the deal terms that we specify, and then design those deal terms to target the kind of value and risk sharing that we expect might be suitable to either side. Of course, this is going to be ultimately a tool that supports the negotiations over exactly what those terms are going to be. Here, the licensing deal that we see has a defined scope. In this case, we're just modeling the drug in the US. If we had a global model and we had a licensing deal that just covered EU commercial rights, we could define the scope just to cover the sales and costs that are associated with Europe. We have the buyer assuming a share of the development costs. We have an upfront payment that's made at the date of deal execution. We have optional development milestones at phase 3 success and approval. We have commercial milestone. We can define that in many different ways. Here we're defining it to be paid out annually after years in which net revenues exceed $1 billion. And then we have a royalty base rate. That royalty base rate is the maximum royalty rate that's paid, but then we have different tranches of net revenues where we decrease the royalty paid in each one of those tranches from the base rate as we move up to higher and higher values of net revenues. What we do then is essentially have the licensor realize more of the benefit on the high end of the net revenues so that they remain incentivized to drive sales of the model. Here we say it's a licensing deal because that term defines within PPFC how we split the costs, where the originator is going to retain R&D cost less whatever fraction is assumed by the buyer, and then the buyer is going to get the sales of the asset within the area of the scope of the disease and incur all of the commercial costs. We can have an M&A deal where the buyer assumes all financials, and we can have other types of deals in which we define unique ways of splitting cost and sales benefits between either party. Here we have a very standard deal term. We have built-in functionality within PPFC to handle this, but we also have the ability within PPFC to handle arbitrary type of deal terms defined however we wish. In addition to just simulating a deal and looking at the economics to either side, we can certainly use that as an iterative tool. We go in, we change the deal terms, and we see what happens. We're also going to program an explicit procedure to size the upfront and development milestone payments for this asset based on targets we give it in terms of the fraction of expected value that's captured by the seller, plus then at each one of the stages the fraction of that seller value that we're going to pay out when we reach each one of the stages. So we're going to write this as a routine using the fact that PPFC, every model operates according to the same set of commands. So we're going to write a routine that we could use to apply the same procedure to any PPFC model. But what we're going to do is we're going to take the expected value when we execute the deal, which is at the start of phase 3. We're going to see how much value do we expect is created by the asset under the terms of the deal, what fraction of that should go to the seller. We subtract the net present value of the development costs that the buyer assumes, and then we pay out a certain fraction of that as the upfront payment. Then when we move forward in time, as we get to phase 3 success and approval, the expected net present value continues to grow because the probability of technical and regulatory success is rising as we mitigate more of the risk of development. We now have the prior costs of development are now sunk and don't work against us when we do the valuation, and all these future sales then become closer in time to the time of the valuation, and all of those attributes then correspond to an increase in expected net present value. So when we get to these milestones, the way that we're going to size these is to see how much is the expected value changed since the last time we had a payment, and then we're going to again target a fraction of that incremental value that's going to go to the seller and a fraction of that amount that we're going to pay out at this time. And to generate the model, there's a lot of different ways that we could do this, either in scripts or by just throwing together a bunch of templates or using a general asset builder to build this model by hand within a graphical user interface. Here we're going to use a script approach, but we're going to do it in a way that you could take the model that we're going to write and apply it to any similar kind of an asset where we're looking at a development drug that's going in a single disease, we want to do an in-licensing deal for it. We could just simply, the way that we're going to write this is make edits to the set of inputs and use the same model. So we're not going to have anything specific to the problem hard-coded into the model. It's going to be very reusable. And that's one of the advantages of PPFC, is that in addition to being able to write individually each one of these models quickly, we can also create a library of models that cover most common situations and then either simply apply those directly or go in and make very easy modifications to those in order to change the structure slightly to the new problem that we have. So we see here the basic structure that we're going to take for the first part of it, the valuation model for the asset, where on the left we have a number of different inputs everything that we need to go into the definition of the model we're going to store in a class called model inputs that's going to contain reference information about the name of the asset, the name of the disease, the name of the segment, etc. The development path, which is going to have the assumptions around our clinical development and market evolution. Then we have a commercial set of inputs around pricing, epidemiology, preference, shares, and how patients are allocated in the flows of the flow diagram. Payer specifications for market access and gross to net. Volume that maps patients to units of volume dispensed. And then finally, commercial costs, which are going to have the cost structure that we layer on top of this asset for commercial costs and investment and capabilities. Finally, then, after all of those inputs to define a base case, we're going to define a number of scenarios. It's going to include high-low scenarios on bounds on key inputs and a go-alone scenario for the case where the originator launches themselves. We give all of these model inputs and we store that into another class we're going to write, valuation model, whose job is to take the inputs, present a built-in PPFC GUI method to edit those inputs if we want to modify them at any time, and then map the set of inputs to a complete set of model specifications that PPFC can use to build the model, which is stored as an instance of PPFC class's asset info. And then finally, we're going to have a short model that just says that it takes whatever the output is of that asset information, defines the model, passes it to a built-in method within PPFC, an object called an asset simulator GUI that's going to create the model, optionally add any additional build-on functionality that we define, which we're going to use later to add the deal to it, and then it launches a GUI to run the model. So now we're going to go through step by step and see what does a Python script look like that defines this model and then runs it. So the first step that we have in here is we're going to import PPFC. PPFC, we use it like any other module. Here we code it in a way where we have a local access to all the source code. In other situations, we may have a different approach in order to access it. But the fundamental thing to understand is you import this like any other module, use it in a Python file, and then you have access to all the different components within it, modules, PPFC templates, PPFC GUI, etc., that are aspects of PPFC that we're going to use in order to build and run the model along the way. We also take the general approach that we want to build these models to be very controlled in terms of the types of inputs that they can accept. If we give it a share, it has to be between 0 and 100%. It's very easy to put an Excel model out there and then very quickly have users break it when they go in and they try to put in nonsensical values. In order to do that, we're going to use a very powerful, commonly used package within Python called Pydantic. We're going to import some different kinds of tools from that in order to do type checks. And we're going to, from typing, import the types of specifications we're going to need to say what inputs are taken into each one of these. We use datetime, a Python package to keep track of calendar dates. We use OS to operate on an operating system. At some stages, we're going to make some reports, and we want to be able to save those to a text file, save those to a working directory, and then open it up for viewing by the user on the fly. And then we make copies of things as needed as we go along. We now go through and define all the inputs for the model. And again, this is going to be a little bit lengthy because, as we said, we want to make this model completely reusable. We don't hard code anything specific to the problem within the model. And so we're going to have an input for everything that we're going to need that's going to be problem specific. Now, rather than just throwing things together into one big set of data, we're going to use different classes to store different sets of the inputs. Here we set all the reference information, things like the names of the drugs, names of the disease, names of the segment, etc., that we're going to provide to the forecast. We use Pydantic in order to do type checking, and we inherit a base model in this class so that anytime we create an instance of it or we try to edit anything within the class, it's going to enforce that the values that we give it have to be the type that we've declared here. We see some strings, we see some date times in this case. We also give default values as we go along. that are going to be the ones for this particular problem. If we wanted then to modify this later for a different problem, all we would do would be to overwrite these defaults either when we create the model for the first time or later when we edit it on the fly. We also, in this case, use a single currency, dollars, because we're just modeling the US. In a global forecast, we could use pounds in Britain, euros in Europe, yen in Japan, have different conversion factors, decide globally whenever we import anything, we want to do so in dollars, and we can take care of all those details within PPFC. Here, for simplicity, we just have a single currency. So this, again, is the same kind of structure that we're going to see over the next couple pages, just for different parts of the model that we're using. We next have the development path assumptions. And first, since we have repeated clinical trials and reviews, we have a dev stage that stores the 3 inputs we need for each one of those stages: probability of technical success, total cost, and the global currency of the model, in this case dollars, and the duration in months. Then in a dev path object, we define the start date of the development, in this case January 2026, and then give different instances of dev stage to describe the statistics of each phase 3 trial and of the regulatory review. We also then add an uncertain competitor launch that has a 50% probability of launching, and we also specify here the date. In this case, we have it as an offset based on the same development time from the same start date as we do for our own drug. Now, we really don't, in this case, need to say specifically when the competitor launches, but in other models, we might actually model not just our drug, but also each one of the competitor drugs as well, particularly when we have an opportunity for second-line use after those drugs. And so by putting in a launch date, if we tie in competitor launch to that approval date, we have all the correct dynamics and timing that we expect based on exactly when our competitor is going to come to market. We next set the pricing, epidemiology, and patient flow information. In pricing, we set the base annual list price and the annual growth rate that we apply here to continuous growth. There's many different ways that we can define pricing, from a scheduled set of price increases, etc. On epidemiology, we similarly define the base prevalence and a continuous growth rate. Again, if we had an explicit schedule of epidemiology year by year, we could use it that way instead. And then in flows, we set the flow dynamics or patient allocation dynamics across the different stocks, moving patients from prevalent to diagnosed to treated to product X in the first line. Here we specify diagnosis and treatment rates, which here they're going to just be constant with time. We could make these change. So for example, if you have drugs at launch, you could have a higher diagnosis rate, higher treatment rate after launch. We have in peak preference shares 2 different values, one with a competitor and one without. And later when we build the model, we're going to make sure we're using the correct assumption based on whether we have a competitor or not. In the launch timing, we can optionally give it a months of launch delay after approval. And we set our uptake schedule, which is peak preference share as a percent of peak over time since launch. Here it increases linearly from 0 to 100% at 7 years. We could have more detailed schedules and draw those from libraries of analogs if we wish. Whenever we give a schedule at values in between it, we just use interpolation between them. Market exclusivity, we give the months of data exclusivity and the date of patent expiration, and then we have a similar schedule for how our share declines from peak preference share after loss of exclusivity, in this case going to 0 by 10 years. We then set the remaining commercial assumptions for each payer, public and private. We're going to have an instance of this payer class that's going to say what share of overall covered lives in the segment does that payer represent. Here we just have dummy values. The access level, which is something that we could change by stock. Here we only have a single stock. We could change by time. Here we just keep a static value. This is a haircut that's applied to peak preference share for things like out-of-pocket expense or payer restrictions. And then we have gross to net rate, which is going to be, again, 2 values, one without a competitor and one with. In volume, we define how to map patients in that stock on product X to units of product X that are consumed. For a unit, we're going to use one of these injections, and we're going to say that the dosing frequency is QW. For dosing frequencies, we use pharmacist notation, QD, BID, QM, Q2M, etc. If none of those fit, we can then specify directly the number of units delivered per month. By default, we assume that there's 1 unit of drug per every dose. We could also do linear pricing where we have units per dose being the milligrams of loading in each injection or each pill, and use our pricing in terms of milligrams of the drug if we wanted. We also set adherence here. In commercial costs, we set the annual cost that we're going to accrue starting from approval, and we specify how many months after LOE is this accruing of a commercial cost going to continue. Next, we have a bolus of investment that's made if and when phase 3 is success. So we say what's the total cost of that? By default, $50 million, and then what is the months over which that's spread? In this case, it's a year. We then take all these commercial assumptions, pricing, epidemiology, flows, payer specifications, volume, costs. We add a few more things like the gross margin and promotional reach, which, like access, is a haircut on the share that we apply, in this case on the efficacy of the marketing and sales support that we have, and we collect all those into a set of commercial inputs. We've now set all the base case assumptions of the model. So now we go through and we set information that's going to govern our scenarios. In this case, we're going to define high and low scenarios, which are going to be driven by uncertainty and 2 key assumptions, our list price and prevalence. We're going to define these on the basis of relative uncertainty of 10% in each. And then we're going to say we're going to have a go-alone scenario where the originator launches on their own without the synergy that we bring it. And so we're going to have a new value of the promotional reach, which is going to decline to 60%, and a new value of this total bolus of investment that needs to happen at phase 3, which is going to grow to 100 million without synergy. After we define the scenarios, then we collect all the inputs that we've done, the reference information, development information, commercial scenarios, into a single class called model inputs. This now contains everything that we need for the problem. Nothing's going to be hard-coded. If we want to use the model that we're going to develop for a new system, all that we would need to do is to go in and edit these model inputs for the new system that we're looking at. Now that we've defined the model inputs, we want to translate that to terms that PPFC can understand in order to build a model. To do that, we use a valuation model class, where we're going to feed it first a group of simulation parameters. We're going to tell where, when we build this model, we want to have the working directory to store all the Excel files and text file reports and everything else that we create. We're going to specify the valuation date and discount rate to use by default when we do net present value calculations. And we're going to say use, when you report patients in volume, use units of 1,000. When you report something in currency, use units of million. After setting the simulation parameters, we create an instance of this class that's going to do this mapping effort. We initialize it by passing a set of model inputs, a set of simulation parameters, and then a process GUI function that has the function of acting upon the model that we're going to create if we want to bind additional functionality. At the moment, by default, it doesn't do anything. Later, we're going to use that function in order to attach all the licensing deal terms and simulations to the model that we create. We now give this class a number of methods to do its job. The first is if we decide that the user at some point wants to edit the inputs before they launch the model, we use a built-in method within PPFC GUI just to present to the user the set of model inputs and then accept any changes they make. We have next a get asset info class that's going to return, based on the current inputs that are stored in the model, this object called PPFC classes asset info that contains all of that information with the context that PPFC needs to build and operate a model for it. And that calls the main workhorse of this routine, map inputs to asset, which is going to take as an input an instance of these model inputs and return this fully contextualized set of descriptions for PPFC that we hold in this class asset info. The way that this works is that we create a blank version of this asset information class that's going to collect the information, and then we go through and we set individual methods to provide each component of the information, and we're going to go through next one by one. We set global parameters, which is high-level market structure, development path, pricing and cost of goods sold information for drugs, which can span across diseases, and then all the disease-specific information for each disease model. Here we only have one. Then we add the scenarios. For global parameters, these are things that record the high-level structure of the model. So we say, when does a forecast begin and end? Those are both inputs that we provide in the reference section. We create a description in text of the model based on how we've defined it, and then we have certain reference information for the name of the asset, description, a short description, and then author citation information. We set the currency. Again, here we have a single global currency, but we can have different local currencies in a global model. We set in structure the names of the different diseases, the segments of each disease, and then the type of the model we're going to use for each disease. Here we have a single disease chronic. We're going to use a prevalence model for. You could have incidence models for short-term antibiotics. You could have cohort models if we have oncology drugs over multiple lines of finite courses of therapy. And you can mix all those together in a single asset model using a different model type for each disease. We then say what payers we're going to model, and then what are the drugs that we're going to model. Now, we could model multiple drugs in our simulation if we wanted to look at competitor cells as well as ours, but particularly when we look at valuation, we say what's the specific subset of drugs and its description that defines the asset that's of primary interest to us. Then we package all this information into the template of global parameters and return it. On development path, now we pass global parameters to it as another input. That's always useful information to have. We use this function to set the sequence of all these uncertain clinical development and market evolution stages and define the prerequisite states that need to be true or false for that stage to occur, and then what other states have their true false setting set based on the success of each stage. Here we set first the competitor launch. We say what's the duration of that is the difference between the start of development and this launch date that we provided. We say and what the probability of technical success is. Here we don't have any cost. We set the duration. We say this is the stage that's going to start if P3 start is equal to true, which it always is, and it's going to set the value of competitor launch, true if we have a competitor, false if it doesn't. And we're going to later come back and make the assumptions in our model be contingent upon the true-false value of that state. Next thing we do is we go into the two parallel phase 3 trials. We do the same thing for each one. We say what's the probability of technical success, total cost, and duration in months, and then what is the success of each one of those. And then we have a P3 stage, which doesn't carry any risk or cost, but only is true if both P3A success and P3B success are equal to true. And then finally, we do a regulatory review. It's only going to occur if phase 3 is successful. If that regulatory review is successful, it sets the state approval to true. If that doesn't happen, approval is false. And so that's the state approval we're going to use to make the sales of our drug contingent upon successful clinical development. After we define all that information, then we package the start date of development and each one of the individual stages into a development path, and we call its build model routine with the global parameters in order to have that path figure out what all the different sequencing of the different stages are, when do each individual states occur, and then it assigns a lot of useful variables and dates based on that information that we're later going to reference in other templates in order to do their job. So build model, again, is what a template in PPFC provides in order to implement the functionality of that template. We next set the pricing and cost of goods sold, or COGS, information for the drug. For pricing, we calculate what the base unit price is, for which we use the second routine that takes the annual list price and divides it by the number of doses delivered per year appropriate to that dosing frequency. And then we pass that base unit price and a continuously annual growth rate in order to grow that price over time. We again could set pricing in different ways by setting price based on a specific change of schedule of price increases over time. And we could also do it in ways where we have, global reference prices and then modify the growth rate and the local price relative to the global reference price as needed. So we have a lot of flexibility on how we set pricing policies. For cost of goods sold, we similarly get the base unit price and now calculate a base unit COGS by taking 1 minus the gross margin and multiplying it by that price. And then we use another template called COGS, again, to set what the value is of cost of goods sold. Now, when we're computing our forecast, the number of volume of units that are consumed each month, we calculate the COGS from that. We now set all the assumptions that depend just on this individual disease through self-disease. And first what we do is we create a number of aliases for the name of the disease, name of the segment, name of the drug, just to keep from writing out the longer values. Here we just have a single disease and segment, single drug, the same kind of approach we would use in a more complicated models with multiple segments, multiple diseases. Here we just have a single one for simplicity. In order to describe a prevalence model, we could have very bespoke dynamics that we build out with individual kind of low-level templates. But here, since it's just a standard disease prevalence model, we can call a very high-level disease prevalence standard template that when we initialize it with the global variables, it tells us what diseases, segments, drugs, payers we have, creates all the different sub-templates for things like epidemiology, assumptions of access by segment, by payer, etc. It'll do all that and initialize it based on the structure of the model. So once we call that, we then go through and we modify the values of the subtemplates that it's created in order to implement our own problem. So for the case of epidemiology, we go into our segment US, into the epidemiology for that, set the base value to, in this case, 200,000, say when the base date, when that value occurs, and what's our annual growth rate that we're going to apply to that around that base date. We then go to the flow structure and we go and we add step by step the flows that we want to model and then describe how patients are allocated according to each flow. So the first thing we do is we add a flow called DX for diagnosis. It's going to move patients from prevalent to diagnosed. We say that it's going to use a static share for diagnosed because we don't need to change that over time. If we needed to, we could change in a very arbitrary way the percent of prevalent patients that move to diagnosed as a function of calendar time, again with simple types of templates and inputs. Here for that single static share, we then say set the segment value in our segment, US, equal to the value that we've set it at. We then do exactly the same thing for the treatment flow, saying what fraction of diagnosed patients are treated. We again use a static share whose value we set for the US. Next we go handle first line allocation of treated patients to our drug product X. We do that by defining the name of the stock that we want to put it in. It'll be product X1L. We add a flow 1L for first line allocation to take patients from treated to put them into this stock. And now we're going to use a dynamic allocation where we're going to have our preference share grow from 0 to a peak as a function of time since launch, stay that way as long as we have market exclusivity, and then decline back to 0 after market exclusivity. We also declare at this point that that stock that we've created is one in which our drug is consumed. By doing this, we let PPFC know where it needs to map patients to drugs units according to the logic that we're going to provide shortly. We now go through and we fill out all the information for this dynamic share that we've created. And we do so, again, first by setting an alias called dyn_share of that specific allocation that's created in the flow structure when we add the flow. We're going to set the shares to the peak share when we have a competitor. In PPFC, in the base case, it assumes that all development is a success, and so in this case that we have a competitor here. Later we're going to make that assumption depend on exactly whether we have a competitor or not. We specify that this dynamic share is contingent upon successfully reaching approval. We can optionally put in a delay in launch from when that approval date occurs. We say that there's going to be an uptake schedule of how preference share is going to go from 0 to peak as a function of time since launch. We say how many months of data exclusivity do we have, when is the date that we lose patent protection for this flow, and in this segment we can modify it by segment if we want, and then we have the schedule of decline in share after loss of exclusivity. Once we do that information and we've set now all the flows and all the drug stocks, we call a method reset for drug stocks in this disease model, which is built into the template. What it's going to do is it's going to see, okay, where have we defined drugs being used? We might have a first line allocation, second line allocation for the same drug that needs different access assumptions, for example. What it's going to do is going to go back and look through the structure and see what changes does it need to make in order to be able to have the assumptions that we want to be able to specify access exactly by where that's drug used, etc. Once we do that, we now go in and we do the payer share assumptions. So first we set the shares of each one of the payers by pulling out the appropriate information from the inputs, where we're saying in this case 60% of US patients are covered by public patients and 40% for private. And then we go through for each payer, get an alias to the payer inputs that's we've provided in a model, and then where is a template for payer specifications for the segment, payer, and drug, and set the access for our stock to the appropriate value, and then the gross to net rate to the value that we have when we have a competitor. And again, that's something that we're going to come back and change later to make it contingent upon the launch of a competitor. And then finally, here we're setting the volume assumptions that map patient counts to units of drug consumed. We again use an alias for simplicity, so we don't have to type out all these individual addresses of where in the disease model the information is contained, but we set the dosing to the specified dosing frequency, set the description of the unit, and the adherence that we provide. To finish these base case assumptions, we then set what the promotional reach is. Again, it's an input that we provide. This is going to be for the case where we have synergy, and later when we define scenarios, we're going to give it an alternative value to use when we model the case where the originator commercializes the drug on a go-alone basis. Once we've done this, we've completed all the base case specifications for the model in terms of dictating the revenues. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add the development state edits to make assumptions in peak, preference share, and gross to net be contingent upon whether a competitor launches or not. So here we use another template called dev state edits for this disease and our segment in the US, and we're going to say we're going to specify a number of edits to make based on whether the value of the development state competitor launch is true or false. The first thing we do is for the peak share, we're going to change that first by going and finding what's the name of the static variable in the model that's created to describe the peak share. And we do that by using functionality built into the templates that return the label that that template is using to describe the piece of information we want. And then with the name of that variable, we say, okay, in the development state edits, the static variable values that we want to change or edit when commercial launch is equal to true is we're going to use the value for when we have a competitor, and then the value we're going to use for that static variable when competitor launch equals false is going to be the value when we don't have a competitor. We then go through and we do the same thing for the gross to net rate. where we go through for each one of the pairs, and we extract the location of the pair specifications. We see what's the name of the static variable that's used in that template to define the gross to net rate. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to say when competitor launch is equal to true, we're going to make the edit to change that variable to the value that we have when we have a competitor. And when competitor launch is equal to false, we're going to use the value that's appropriate when we don't have a competitor. We next add the cost structure to the model. We're going to have two costs that we're going to add. The first is going to be an annualized cost that's going to run from approval through some time after loss of exclusivity. Now we want to be able to modify the end date based on the assumptions in the model, so we need to define a static variable for the number of months that we continue commercial costs after loss of exclusivity, and we want to define a named date that defines when do we stop commercial costs after that time. And so since we're going to be defining a cost, we're going to be referring to a static variable and a date in that. Since there's multiple things that we have to define in order to implement the cost, we're going to use a template called aggregate modules, which can take a number of subtemplates and just stitch them together into a single one that we can refer to. And it's just a method of, again, structuring and layering on the inputs that we have. So we define that aggregate module, and then we're going to say, okay, within that, as the label months post LOE, we're going to store a template that defines a static variable that's going to pull in from our model inputs how many months after loss of exclusivity do we want to be continuing to incur commercial costs. We then next set a date for when that commercial costs stop by extracting from the development path the date of reaching approval, the name that's created for that in the model, and then we also extract the name that's used to store the loss of exclusivity date when we define that in the dynamic share. And then we use a date template where we say set a date named commercial cost stop date in this disease and segment that's going to be equal in time to a date that's this named LOE date, and then the offset of the number of months that we've just defined. We then say that there's an annualized segment cost in this disease and segment that's going to give the name commercial, that's going to run from approval date through the end date that we've just defined. It's only going to be incurred if we're successfully reached approval, and we're going to incur during that period and on an annualized basis the commercial cost that we define. By doing it this way, we've done a lot of advanced logic on the model where we have now a cost structure that only is incurred between a start and an end time that's directly linked to the development path timing and the assumptions we make around market exclusivity and how long we want to continue expending on commercial support after loss of exclusivity. The last thing we do is add a bolus of investment. Here we have a different segment called bolus segment cost, where we take a total cost of this investment divided by the number of months over which we spread it. That's a monthly value. And then we say that we're going to incur this monthly cost starting at the trigger date of phase 3 success, and it's going to continue for a number of months after that. So once we do this, we've now defined everything that's specific to that disease, and we use another one of these aggregate modules in order to collect it together. All the standard inputs around the disease, preference flows, access, volume, etc. Then we have the development state edits that describe how we're going to change our assumptions around peak share and gross to net based on whether we have a competitor or not. And then the two costs that we've defined, this annualized commercial cost and a bolus of investment at phase 3. The last piece of information we need to define the model, again in the language that PPFC is going to accept to build the model, is the language that defines the scenarios. Here we do that through another routine set scenarios. We're going to define two different types of scenarios. We're going to define a set of high and low scenarios that are being bounded based on uncertainty in the list price and the prevalence. To do that for each one of these scenarios, we calculate what the new base price and new prevalence should be based on our base values and the relative uncertainty in each one of those, and then whether we want to modify it to be on the high end or the low end. Those define a set of edits to static variables that are created when we create the model that we're going to overwrite with these new values when that scenario is active. And then we provide that information to PPFC using a template called scenario that says, in this case, make the following changes. In a disease and a segment, I want to make these edits to static variables. We then do the same thing for the go alone scenario, where now we see what are the two static variables that we need to change, one for the monthly bolus cost and one for the promotional reach for product X when it's used in the first line. And then we again say, when we have a scenario named go alone, in our disease and segment, I want to make the change that I specify to the monthly bolus cost amount and to the promotional reach. We've now defined this map inputs to asset method that is going to take all a set of model inputs and then provide a full description for PPFC on the model that it needs. So the last thing we do in this class is we have a method called generate GUI, which is going to create an instance of the model in a graphical user interface to run it. And the way this works is we tell it, first of all, okay, do I want to launch the GUI or not? What it does is it creates a graphical user interface that simulates the asset. It does it by a built-in method that's in PPFC GUI, where we pass it the model inputs that we want to use, this map function that we've defined, and then the other simulation parameters like the name of the model we want to use, the location of the working directory, the valuation date, discount rate, and what kind of units we want to report results in. And then once we create that asset simulator, which is doing all the work for us, so what we've defined up until this point is just saying what are the dynamics that we want to see. When we have this single line, that's what automates all the process of creating the model, wrapping it in a simulator, wrapping that in a graphical user interface to operate it, and then handing it back to us as an object that we can use. The last thing that we do here, which at the moment doesn't do anything, is we pass this model that we've just created through this process GUI function that we've linked to it, and we're going to use that in a moment to attach the deal simulation to it before we launch it. And we launch it by using just the run method of that, and it opens up the window. We can do that in a second, but first thing we want to do is define the deal terms that we're going to link to this. So now we're going to layer on top of this the licensing deal and how we're going to evaluate it. We have a similar way of describing deal terms, just like we have for describing assets, where we build it up using a number of different kind of templates and values, in this case contained within the PPFC deals module. We define a licensing deal class that's going to set the terms of the licensing deal as inputs, where again we're using Pydantic to define what are allowable types of upfront payments, shares of development costs, etc. to assume. We have in here default values of a $50 million upfront, 50% split where the buyer assumes development costs, no milestone at phase 3, and a $100 million milestone at approval, and a $10 million milestone after every year in which we have $1 billion in net revenues and a 5% royalty base rate. We're going to create the deal with those default values, and then we're going to modify that when we run the model. What we need to do is we need to take those numerical inputs, and just like we did before, is map those numerical values into a language that PPFC can use to construct the structure of the deal and simulate it. And we use this deal design method for that. What we do is we set and we use a number of different templates, first to define an upfront payment of this payment amount at the execution date of the deal. We're going to define that there's going to be a sharing of the trial costs and the review costs of the specified share that the buyer is going to assume. We set development milestones for phase 3 success and approval that are going to be triggered by the success of the appropriate state. The timing is also going to be triggered by that. We could add an offset if we wanted to have a delay, and then we specify the amounts of those payments that are made. We specify a commercial milestone. There's many ways we can do that. Here we define it on an annual recurrent basis, so we're going to trigger a new milestone payment every year after this threshold is met. The threshold is going to be meeting $1 billion in net revenues, and we're going to pay our payment amount based on that. And then we set a tier structure. We're going to define that through royalty tiers, defined based on revenues that are between a lower and upper bound as a percent of estimated peak net revenues, and it's going to be a multiplier in each one of those of the base rate to determine the local royalty rate based on revenues in that tranche. And then we combine that tier structure with the base rate to get the overall specification of the royalties, and then we just collect all that information of the different milestone payments, cost sharing, commercial payments into a deal design and return it. Here we have just a standard structure. We also have ways that you can define arbitrary type of terms that work however you want to define it in order to define a set of payments. Once we've defined this licensing deal, we use a deal model class in order to basically integrate that deal with an instance evaluation model. When we create a version of this class, we're going to pass it the set of model inputs, simulation parameters, and then all the deals that we want to link to it. In this case, we're only going to have one licensing deal that we're going to name out license at phase 3. And then we have a flag here on whether we launch the graphical user interface when we do it or not. When we initialize it, it stores the deals, it creates, using the logic we've already done, a valuation model, and then it calls the generate a GUI process of that valuation model, where we now use this processing function that we've defined in here to attach the deal simulation to it. That process GUI function that we defined, the first thing we do is we add in a built-in functionality to evaluate deals, and we tell it, what are the deals that we want to evaluate. We also then add in a method that we're going to define, which is going to be a design process to specify the upfront and milestone payments based on the asset economics, and then we specify that we want to also add in additional functionality. In this case, it's going to be functionality that does both Monte Carlo over development uncertainty and input uncertainty as well. We then have a run method at the end that runs the simulation whenever we want. Now, when we have built-in functionality like evaluating the deals or doing this coupled Monte Carlo simulation, it's just a single line to add that just by pulling in the appropriate functionality that's been predefined within PPFC. We do this so that you have a whole variety of different options that you can continue to layer on, but we also want to give users and model developers the opportunity where they can create and append their own methods to the models that they create in a way that they can reuse again and again for every model. So minimal rewriting that you have to do exactly the right kind of calculation that you want, but just on different assets. Here, to demonstrate that, we define a bespoke method we're going to call add milestone design, which is going to be part of this process of adjusting our graphical user interface to attach to it a method that's going to run what we want to do, which is going to be setting the upfront and milestone payments for the deal associated to it. The way that we add extra functionality is we bind methods to the instance of this PPFC GUI Asset Simulator GUI object. And so since we're binding a method to it, when we write this method next, self in this case is going to refer to that simulator object that we just create. So when we think about this, and once you create one of these models, you can dive in and see the individual components and understand how that works. But just to understand here is we're acting on an object that's a GUI that runs the simulation of an asset, and self is going to be, in this case, referencing to it. What we want to do is we want to first get some inputs from the user on how to set up the upfront milestone payment. So what fraction of value that's created by the asset do we want to target as going to the seller? We use a pop-up window that's defined within GUI in order to get that value. We then want to say separately at upfront and each subsequent milestone which percent of the seller share of expected value do you want to pay out at that time. Again, this is something that's less than 100% because you want to share the risk, but you don't want to just assume all of it at every stage of the development. Then next, we ask the user whether they want to have a milestone added at phase 3 success and one at approval. And then we create some report text that we're going to end up saving and displaying to the user in a text file that's going to explain what it's doing as it does these calculations. So it's going to initially just say, all right, here's what you input when you run the model. Next, we get some information from the simulator that's stored within this GUI that essentially actually has included in it the model and the assumptions around how to handle currency, etc. So we get an alias to that simulator, and we also extract from it certain information around what kind of currency we're reporting in global units, what are the units that we're using, etc. So we do that information next. And now what we do is we go through the process of designing it, which I had outlined earlier, and we use the built-in functionality of PPFC objects that are always the same for every model in order to do this analysis in a script that can be applied to any PPFC model. So the first thing we do is we go to the model that's stored within this object. It's an instance of PPFC class asset, and that's the thing that actually does expected value calculations, forecasting. It does all of the work for us. Everything else is just a way of presenting a GUI to run it, etc. So we're going to use that model, and we're going to use its value over dev method to say, do a simulation where you do Monte Carlo over all possible development outcomes, forecast and value the asset in each one of those outcomes, and report to me what then the total picture is of a risk and value basis. So it does that using the base scenario by saying the only thing we're going to say is that phase 3 starts, but everything else is left unspecified. We're not going to plot this. We're going to do these calculations on an annualized basis. And then it does the expected net present value calculation. We can extract the expected net present value at start from the results and add that to the report. We then multiply that expected net present value by the fraction that we want to target that goes to the seller, report that, and then we use, again, functionality of the simulator that stores forecasts, and we want to say, let's get the information for the base case about the cost structure that we have and the overall P&L and EBIT. We extract the total development costs from that view of the cost, and we extract the discount factors for net present value from the EBIT P&L calculation, and use those together to get what is the net present value of the development costs that are assumed by the buyer. And we add that to report. And then finally what we do is we say, now that we've calculated that, if we take the share of the initial starting expected value that's supposed to go to the seller, subtracted by the net present value of these development costs that the buyer is assuming, that gives us a remaining expected net present value. We're going to pay out a certain fraction of that, and that's going to be our upfront payment. So we do those calculations and then add it to the report after rounding the payments we make to the nearest 100,000 just for simplicity. To finish this design process, we now go through each one of the milestones and we do a similar calculation to see what each milestone payment should be. So for phase 3 success, we say, what's the date in the development path where we reach phase 3 success? How do I convert that to a string, which we use for reference later? We want to now calculate the expected net present value, where now we assume that we've achieved success in phase 3. So when we set development states, in addition to P3 start being true, we're going to have true values, success values for P3A success, P3B success, and P3 success. Now when we calculate Monte Carlo over development uncertainty, it's going to be making the outcomes conditional upon that, so we're going to have less development risk when we do this sampling. And we also now, for our valuation date, gave it the name of the date that we've extracted from here, so all of the phase 3 costs will now be sunk because they occur before the valuation date and don't get included in our calculation. We get this new value, the expected value, save that to the report, and then we see how much is the expected net present value increased over what I've already been paying out, and then I calculate a new milestone payment from that. If I decide when I design the deal that I want to include a milestone of phase 3 success, and I report the value of that milestone to the report. When we then get to the approval milestone, it's going to be the same approach. We're going to get the date at which we would reach approval. We're going to now add approval equals true to specify now that we've been successful in reaching approval. Now when we calculate the expected value over development uncertainty, it's only uncertainty in whether we have a competitor or launch. We now have even a yet later date, so all the upfront bolus investment, the review costs are now sunk and no longer included. We get an even higher value of the expected value. We now look at the expected net present value of approval, and we calculate how much has changed since we have had the last payout, and we calculate what the milestone payment is based on that. Now that we've calculated the entire procedure and written all the calculations to the report, what we do is we open up a text file with that name, write the report to it, and then we call the operating system to start up that file, so we present the written report to the user. And then we call the method that we've already attached that's built in that evaluates deals. So now we can see what is the effect of this change in upfront and milestone values on the economics of the deal. Now this completes this method that we're going to attach to the simulator. And so what we do at the end is we just bind this method that we've just created, and we give it the name set deal upfront and milestone payments, and add that to the simulator GUI. And once we've done this, we've completed all the modeling that we need to do in order to run this example. And so now in the main routine of the script, all we do is we create an instance of deal model. And when we do that, we say launch GUI equals to true, and it goes ahead, automatically assembles the model that we have, and then opens up this window where we can go under different menu options, under run to calculate forecasts, value the asset over development uncertainty, run Monte Carlo over input uncertainty defined by scenarios, run the evaluation of the deals that we've attached, run this process that we've created to set the deal upfront and milestones based on this bespoke procedure that we've defined, and then run this additional method that we added to do Monte Carlo over coupled input uncertainty and development uncertainty. Under view, we can view the description of the model we created, view the structure of it, the stock and flow models, view the flows, view the base assumptions, and view the entire syntax that creates it. Under analyze, we can go in and review the forecasts, any that we've created for the base case, low or high scenarios, go alone scenarios. We can analyze calculated forecasts that we generate with bespoke edits, do sensitivity analyses, and do waterfall charts. Now for the operation of this, see the earlier video that we made that takes you through all the steps of using this model for this in-licensing deal. That concludes this video on the coding details. If you have more questions, please reach out to me at kbeers@boxfordls.com.